Starting to collect recurring payments with Stripe Checkout is the next step. And now that we have an authenticated user and we have a pricing page that's going to give us the ID of a price, we're ready to go. Checkout is a page that's hosted by Stripe where we're going to redirect customers. They will fill out some payment information that'll start a subscription, and they'll ultimately be redirected back to our application. Using Stripe Checkout is the recommended way to collect recurring payments for your SaaS business. This integration includes one API call to create this thing called a checkout session. That'll have a URL property on it that we're going to redirect customers to. I know there's a lot of arguments there, but I definitely recommend going through the API reference for creating a checkout session and looking at every single possible argument. And depending on your business, you may want to enable some or disable others. So go ahead and take a look at the documentation for creating checkout sessions. Recall that we have a pricing page here, but when we click on the button to start the subscription, we're redirected to /checkout, and we haven't actually implemented this. In the query string parameters, we have a price ID, and that is going to be the ID of the price for the related tier, subscription, the recurring interval, the currency, and the amount that we want to subscribe to. We're going to take that price ID and create a checkout session with it. Let's create a new controller called checkouts. Inside of our checkouts controller, we're going to add a new action inside of show, which will create the checkout session and redirect us. Before we implement that, we want to make sure that we have an authenticated user on this page before we let them do anything. So we're going to have a before action authenticate user. Now inside of the show action, we're going to create a checkout session. Now you can create one directly using the Stripe Ruby gem with Stripe checkout sessions.create, session singular.create, and passing in all of your different arguments, including the mode of subscription and a customer ID like this. Now, if you've stored the customer ID in your own database and you're manually building an integration, this is the way that you would want to go. Because we're using the pay gem, here we can say current user.payment processor.checkout. We're going to pass along the mode as subscription, and line items are going to be simply params price ID. That's going to create a checkout session object with all of the sensible defaults. We will redirect to the checkout sessions URL. We need to allow other hosts because when we're using Stripe Checkout, we're going to be redirected to checkout.stripe.com. We also are going to set the status to see other. Now, when we're using pay, this is really all that we need to get started. So we need to add a route here for resource checkout. Now, when we make that GET request, we're redirected to the checkout page. We can either use our link authenticated payment method, which is pre-populated here because we're logged in with this existing user, or we could use another payment method. In this case, we could use a US bank account that will debit our bank account $28 every single month. Now, when we click subscribe, we are ultimately redirected back to our application. Notice that in the query string, we have access to the ID of that checkout session. If we wanted to, we could display things or information about the checkout session here. We could also customize where the customer is redirected back to. Now, the most important thing is that we actually provision access and give someone access once they have paid and subscribed. That we're going to do in another episode. Before we get there, though, I wanted to talk about a couple different things. The first of which is inside of our checkout sessions controller, or inside of our checkouts controller, although this is the simplest way to do it, and this is the way that we recommend using the pay gem to create a checkout session, you could also create a checkout session directly using Stripe Ruby gem by saying Stripe checkout session.create, and then passing in all of your own arguments. In which case, we do need to include a customer object. Pay is going to include that for us by default, but here we would need to say something like current user.payment processor.processor ID. But in order to use that processor ID, we first need to cache the user object and make sure that we have a customer. So we're going to say current user.paymentProcessor.customer. Now again, this is only required if we're going to use Stripe Ruby directly. All right, so line items by default are a list of items. And we're going to pass in the price and a quantity. If you wanted to have a per seat model where customers paid per user on their account, for instance, then you might want to use this quantity to control how many seats they've purchased. In our case, we're only going to limit it to 1 seat. You can also make this adjustable inside of Stripe Checkout using adjustable quantity. When we create a checkout session, we also need to pass a success URL and a cancel URL. The success URL defines where the customer will be redirected after they've successfully subscribed. The cancel URL is where we're going to send the customer if they bail out and say return to your application. All right, let's take this for a spin by going back to our pricing page, and this time we'll go for the $32 a month subscription level. We're redirected to checkout. Again, now we see this $32 per month. There's a lot of different things that we can enable with Stripe Checkout. For instance, we might want to enable automatic tax calculation. So we could say automatic tax enabled true. Now, if we want to enable automatic taxes, we also need to enable customer address updating. So if we go back, let me show you what I mean. So if we go back to localhost and we go through the payment flow here and we're redirected to checkout, we're going to see an error that says automatic tax calculation requires a valid address. So we either need to update the customer object with an address, or we need to allow the customer's address to be updated. So let's add this argument to our checkout session create call so that we can update the customer's address. So we'll go through this checkout flow again. Sorry, customer update address, auto. Now we can see that sales tax is being calculated as part of the checkout process. That's pretty neat. Another feature of checkout that I find very handy is being able to pass through some metadata. So we can pass metadata at the top level here and specify that the user ID that this checkout session is for is our current user.id. We can also set some metadata on the subscription. So we can say subscription data has some metadata for the user ID, again, being the current user's ID. Since we're using the PayGem, Pay is going to handle a lot of the webhook work for us, so we won't actually have to worry about this too much. As a pro tip, if you're implementing this without Pay, I'd highly recommend attaching the metadata with reference to the current user, both at the checkout session level and the subscription level. Let's take a look at one other thing we can do. We can enable promotion codes with allow promotion codes true. Now, if we were to go back through checkout, this time let's try out our enterprise tier. We'll see that we can enter in a promotion code if we happen to have one. And click apply. And now we have 20% off. So that's pretty neat. Again, there's a number of different options for creating a checkout session. This might look a little bit daunting, but really it's just configuring the experience that your customers have when they redirect through checkout. Let's say we want to continue through with this subscription and we click subscribe. Now when we're redirected to the landing page, we don't have any indication that the customer is actually subscribed. And if we attempt to access the dashboard, in fact, we're redirected back to the pricing page. So how do we know if the customer is actually subscribed? Great question, and that's something that we're going to answer in the next episode when we talk about provisioning, and we're going to talk about setting up your webhook events and your webhook forwarding. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.